It was a warm summer morning in Rome, the kind of golden day when the sun kisses the marble columns of ancient ruins and tourists flood the streets with gelato in hand. At Leonardo da Vinci Fiumicino Airport, flight AZ714 to Palermo was boarding. It was a massive Airbus A330, bigger than usual for this route, but deployed that day to accommodate unexpected demand. Among the 223 passengers was Luca Benedetti, a 47-year-old systems engineer from Milan. Tall, quiet, unassuming, he wore a navy blue polo and carried a paperback novel. To the flight attendants, he was just another businessman on another trip. No one, not even he, could imagine the role he would play before that flight reached the sky. Captain Enzo Grimaldi, 62, was a veteran pilot with over 18,000 flight hours. He was respected among the crew, known for his precision and calm demeanor. His co-pilot, First Officer Alessia Mancini, 36, was newer but sharp, competent and calm. The two made small talk as the aircraft taxied to the runway. Grimaldi made a joke about finally taking his wife on that cooking trip to Bologna once he hit retirement in a few months. Flight AZ714 took off at 9:42 a.m., a few minutes behind schedule, but otherwise smooth. The cabin was calm, families with children settled into cartoons, businessmen opened laptops, flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle with espresso, pastries, and juice. For the first 30 minutes, it was ordinary. The aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet over the rolling green hills of Tuscany. The cockpit chatter was routine. Headings, speed adjustments, a bit of banter about the upcoming Serie A season. Luca sat in seat 14A, reading a chapter about artificial intelligence and sipping his coffee. He looked out the window, admiring the patchwork of vineyards and villages below, unaware that something catastrophic was about to unfold. At 10:17 a.m., just south of Florence, something changed in the cockpit. Captain Grimaldi paused mid-sentence. His voice faltered. He looked at Mancini, then at his hands, and said just one word: "Strano, strange." Then his head slumped forward. His hands fell from the yoke. The plane jolted slightly. First Officer Mancini immediately took control, her hands steady but her voice rising. "Enzo! Enzo!" No response. His breathing was shallow. His skin had gone pale. She hit the emergency intercom. "Medical emergency in the cockpit. Request immediate assistance." Flight attendants rushed forward, dragging the emergency medical kit. A nurse who happened to be on board responded. They worked quickly, checking his pulse, elevating his legs, but it was clear Captain Grimaldi was unconscious. The passengers didn't know yet. The seatbelt light came on. A voice over the intercom, unusually tense, instructed everyone to remain seated. But in the galley, a storm was brewing. Back in 14A, Luca felt the shift. Not just the slight drop in altitude, but something deeper. A silence that wasn't normal. Flight attendants, usually calm, now whispered in clipped tones. A passenger across the aisle muttered, "Something's not right." Minutes passed. Then, over the intercom, the first officer made an announcement. Her voice was controlled, but everyone could hear the strain. "This is First Officer Mancini. We are experiencing a medical emergency with the captain. I am currently flying the aircraft. We request that any licensed pilots or individuals with flight experience identify themselves to the crew immediately." The cabin went silent. No one moved. Until one man raised his hand. "I'm not a licensed pilot," Luca said slowly, almost regretting the words as they left his mouth. "But I trained on simulators years ago. I used to work on aircraft systems." A flight attendant locked eyes with him. "Please come with me." Luca stood up. The eyes of the cabin followed him like a current. He felt sweat bead at his temple. What was he doing? He was led forward, past the galleys, into the sacred space of the cockpit, something no passenger ever expects to see mid-flight. And what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Captain Grimaldi was slumped in his seat, oxygen mask on, still unresponsive. First Officer Mancini was flying solo, fielding rapid messages from Rome ATC, managing flight instruments, monitoring systems, all while holding back the panic of being suddenly alone. She turned to Luca, scanning him top to bottom. "You said you know aircraft systems?" "I do. I've worked with Airbus Avionics, trained in full simulators. But I've never flown a real aircraft." Her eyes narrowed. "Then today, you're going to." In that moment, the cockpit door closed. Behind it, silence, fear, and over 200 lives. Ahead, only clouds, confusion, and the hope that one man, untrained, unlicensed, could help land a jumbo jet. The door clicked shut behind Luca with a chilling finality. For the first time in his life, he was inside the cockpit of a flying commercial aircraft, not as an engineer, not in a simulator, but in the real thing, with nearly 300,000 kilograms of steel, fuel, and human lives soaring at 35,000 feet, and no captain at the controls. First Officer Mancini didn't hesitate. Her voice was clipped, professional. "Strap in," she said. "Right seat." Luca slid into the co-pilot's seat. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the harness, finally snapping it into place. The panel in front of him glowed with a dozen screens. Artificial horizon, altitude, fuel flow, nav map, system status. It all looked familiar, but terribly more alive than in the simulators he'd trained on years before. "I need your help monitoring systems. I can fly, but I can't do everything," Mancini said. Her hands danced across the yoke, the throttle, the autopilot settings. "We're stable now. Autopilot is engaged, heading 190. But we can't stay up here. We need to divert and get on the ground fast." Luca nodded. Okay, let me orient myself." He scanned the PFD, trying to suppress the pounding of his heart. Every beep, every flicker of a light seemed like an alarm. He remembered the checklists, the protocols, but none of that training had prepared him for the raw weight of this reality. Down below, in the passenger cabin, a quiet panic was beginning to set in. Whispers turned into murmurs. Some passengers clutched armrests. A mother near row 20 pressed her forehead to the window, as if trying to divine what was happening. The attendants, trained to project calm, began walking the aisle slower, more deliberately, handing out water with trembling fingers. Back in the cockpit, Rome ATC crackled through the headset. A330, confirm status of Captain Grimaldi. Mancini replied in fluent, rapid Italian, "The captain is unconscious. Medical team attempted resuscitation, no response. I am flying alone with assistance from an avionics engineer in the right seat, requesting emergency landing options. Nearest large airport." There was a pause on the line. Then came the calm voice of the controller. "Copy, AZ714. Diverting you to Naples Capodichino. Runway 24 in use, weather clear, vectors incoming. Naples, a mountainous descent but manageable." "Prepare for descent in 90 seconds, Mancini said. "Can you call out flaps, gear, and help manage fuel systems?" "I'll try," Luca replied, scanning for the fuel crossfeed. It was like a foreign language he'd once spoken fluently and now had to recall under fire. And then, the worst moment yet, a jolt. The autopilot disengaged. The familiar chime echoed through the cockpit. Mancini's hands flew to the yoke. "What happened?" "Possible turbulence. We lost trim," Luca shouted. "Pitch is fluctuating." The aircraft began to drift slightly left, nose nudging downward. Mancini fought it back. Luca scanned the systems. No engine issues, no stall indications, hydraulics intact. The controls were just heavier now. Then, another alarm. "Cabin altitude warning." Luca read aloud. "Cabin pressure anomaly. Check bleed air system." Luca dove into the overhead panel, toggling through the ECS settings. One of the cabin packs had auto-shut down, likely due to the earlier medical emergency and oxygen deployment. He rerouted air supply and waited for the pressure to stabilize. Slowly, the alarm ceased. but every second felt like an hour. "Okay, we've got pressurization back," he said, breathing hard. Mancini was pale but focused. "You're doing good. Just keep breathing. Tell me about your simulator time. How many hours?" "About 160, mostly on the A320 family, but that was 8 years ago," Luca admitted. Mancini didn't flinch. "Muscle memory is better than nothing. I need you with me." He nodded. "I'm here." Down below, the lead flight attendant knocked gently on the cockpit door. Mancini pressed the intercom. "We're preparing for descent," she announced to the cabin. "Remain calm. Flight is under control. Emergency crews will meet us on the ground." Luca felt his throat close. It was happening. He was about to help land an Airbus A330. He thought of his daughter, sleeping in her dorm in Bologna, of his wife texting him that morning, of his old mentor who once told him, "The scariest part of aviation isn't failure. It's the moment someone turns to you, and you realize you're the only one who can act." That moment had come. In 10 minutes, they would begin their descent. In 15, they'd either be on the ground or written into history. In the cabin of AZ-714, time had begun to bend. Minutes passed like hours. The usual monotony of a routine flight was gone, replaced with something electric in the air, unspoken, tense, tangible. It started with subtle cues, the unexpected tone of the first officer's announcement, the prolonged absence of the captain, the brief moment when the aircraft shuddered just enough to silence every conversation. Passengers glanced at each other, then at the flight attendants, looking for confirmation that all was well. But even the most composed attendants couldn't fully hide what their eyes betrayed. Something had gone very wrong. In seat 19C, an elderly couple clutched hands. The woman, who had just finished her crossword puzzle, whispered something to her husband that ended with the words, "Non è normal." Not normal. 2 rows behind them, a teenage boy pulled out his phone and began texting furiously, first to his group chat, then to his mother. "I think something's wrong with the flight." He didn't know that, by protocol, the aircraft's internal communications were being jammed automatically to avoid panic. In business class, a woman in a sleek grey suit tapped a flight attendant on the arm. "Is the captain okay?" she asked in English. The attendant hesitated for half a second. Too long. "The situation is under control," she replied, softly but firmly, and walked away without another word. Back in the galley, the 3 main cabin crew members huddled for a moment, whispering. One of them, Sophia, had been working flights for over 12 years. She had seen medical incidents, minor electrical malfunctions, even turbulence severe enough to knock over carts. But never, not once, had she been told the captain was incapacitated, and certainly not that a passenger had entered the cockpit to assist. She looked at the door separating them from the flight deck, then back at her colleagues. "If something goes wrong," she whispered, "we won't have time to prepare. No warning, just..." Her voice faded. The crew snapped back into action. Emergency equipment was rechecked, seats were cleared, infants were cradled tighter. And then came the announcement from the first officer, the one that made everything real. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Mancini. Due to a medical emergency, the captain is unable to continue flying. I am in command of the aircraft with assistance from a qualified passenger. Please remain calm and seated. We are diverting to Naples. Emergency crews will be waiting for us. We appreciate your cooperation." There it was. Words that would be replayed in news cycles, documentaries, and memories for decades. A civilian helping land a jet. The full weight of the situation crashed down on every soul in that plane. In seat 14B, a middle-aged man from Florence with a nervous flying history began shaking uncontrollably. His seatmate offered water, but his hands couldn't hold the cup. "Not the pilot. Anyone but the pilot," he kept repeating. A flight attendant crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The first officer is trained. The aircraft is stable. We will land safely." But even she wasn't sure. Meanwhile, Luca was locked in his own internal storm. Inside the cockpit, every decision began to feel heavier. There were no brakes, no reassurances, just blinking lights and rising stakes. He could feel the pressure not only in his temples, but deep in his chest, a weight he couldn't shake. For all his experience with systems, avionics, and simulated emergencies, nothing compared to this. Mancini noticed it too. Between course corrections and checklist calls, she glanced at him. "Hey, breathe. You're doing fine." He gave a tight nod. "Feels like every cell in my body is screaming that I shouldn't be here." She didn't smile. That's what being responsible feels like. They were 23 minutes from Naples. Down below, the air traffic control center was fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Naples International had cleared the main runway. Emergency services were already standing by. Fire trucks, ambulances, medics. A secure perimeter had been activated. Controllers coordinated alternate approaches in case wind shifted. A retired flight instructor had been patched in as a secondary advisor, ready to coach through the radio if necessary. But on board, there was no instructor. Only Alessia Mancini and Luca Benedetti. As the aircraft began a slow descent, engines humming at reduced thrust, Luca started reading every checklist aloud. Gear status, hydraulic backup, flaps check, cabin alert. It came to him like fragments of a song he'd memorized long ago. Mancini responded in clipped confirmations. Her voice was like flint, sharp, steady, unyielding. Then she switched frequencies. "This is AZ714 to Naples Tower. We are on emergency descent. Estimated touchdown in 14 minutes. Co-pilot flying solo, passenger assisting." The reply came in immediately. "Copy AZ714. Winds calm. Runway 24 clear. You are priority 1. Cleared direct. Emergency units in position." The city of Naples was beginning to appear on the horizon, glittering with sunlit rooftops and the silhouette of Vesuvius far in the distance. From the cockpit, it looked almost serene. In the cabin, silence had replaced conversation. Some cried quietly, others prayed. One man wrote a message on a napkin and slipped it into his wallet. In row 26, a teenage girl took a picture out of her bag, a photo of her family, and held it to her chest. Everyone had the same thought. Who is this man helping fly our plane, and is he going to bring us home alive? Luca stared out the cockpit window, watching the shape of the Italian coastline creep closer. The blue of the Tyrrhenian Sea met the faint smudge of Naples in the distance. Somewhere behind him, over 200 passengers were likely praying or frozen in silence. And here he was, at the controls of an Airbus A330, a man who hadn't set foot in a simulator in nearly a decade. He was a systems engineer by trade. His career had been built not in the air but on the ground, working behind the scenes with avionics companies, building flight instrumentation software and running test sequences. Years ago, he'd spent months inside simulators, training engineers and occasionally helping flight crews troubleshoot integration issues. He knew every display, every failsafe, every line of code. But he had never taken off or landed a plane outside a digital screen. When First Officer Mancini had asked him to take the right seat, his first instinct had been to say no. He wasn't licensed. He wasn't current. He wasn't qualified. But in those first few seconds, something inside him overruled the fear. A simple, undeniable truth. There was no one else. He now reached for the flight control unit, scanning heading and altitude readouts. The descent profile was steep but manageable. Mancini adjusted the vertical speed, and the aircraft responded, a slight dip in the nose, smooth and steady. "You've done sim work, right?" Mancini asked without taking her eyes off the controls. "Yeah," Luca said, keeping his voice low and even. "Mostly on A320s. I helped design some parts of the ECAM system." "That explains a lot. But I've never landed anything this big, not even virtually." "You're not here to land," she said. "You're here to help me not crash." He almost laughed. Almost. They worked in rhythm. She flew, he monitored, he ran checklists, she confirmed inputs. And in that tenuous balance, something strange happened. He began to feel useful. Not heroic, not calm, but focused. For a brief moment, a memory struck him, a simulator session in Toulouse 7 years earlier. He had been in the co-pilot seat while a test pilot practiced dual-engine failure scenarios. He had watched, wide-eyed, as the pilot narrated each movement calmly, eyes scanning constantly, fingers gliding across switches like a pianist. That man had told him, "Flying is discipline. Feeling fear is fine, just don't let it fly the plane." Now, those words echoed. From the rear of the aircraft, the purser called in over the intercom. "Passengers are secured, emergency positions reviewed, ready for landing." Mancini nodded. "Good. Let's hope we make it in one piece." "Just keep flying the numbers," Luca said, "one step at a time." Outside the windshield, the Bay of Naples expanded. Runway 24 loomed somewhere beyond the haze. And with each nautical mile, the world waited to see if this man, this passenger, could help turn the unthinkable into survival. The cockpit air had grown heavier as the descent began. Luca could feel it. How the aircraft responded slightly differently now that it was leaving cruise altitude. The A330's inertia was immense. Every adjustment had to be calculated, no room for guesswork. The illusion of control was fading. Now, it was real. Every click of a switch echoed in his skull. First Officer Mancini monitored the descent path, occasionally checking in with Rome Center and then Naples Tower. Her voice remained composed, clear, but every second ticking by added new weight to her words. "Speed is good. Glide slope captured. We're 25 miles out." Luca followed along, silently mouthing the call-outs he remembered from years ago. His hand hovered over the flap lever. "Tell me when." She nodded. "Not yet. Let's get her stabilized." The autopilot was still handling most of the descent, but Mancini had warned him they would take manual control soon. "At 10 miles out, we're hands-on. No time to rely on automation once we start the approach." Luca looked down at his display. The landing checklist glared back at him. Gear down, spoilers armed, auto-brake medium, reverse thrust ready, fuel balanced. It all sounded familiar, but in the pit of his stomach, he knew familiarity didn't equal readiness. "I'm not a pilot," he whispered more to himself than to her. "You are today," she said sharply, "and we're going to do this together." Behind the cockpit door, the rest of the cabin remained in suspended silence. The lead flight attendant continued to reassure passengers with soft, steady instructions. Some passengers had closed their eyes, as if sleeping could block out the dread. Others held hands across the aisle, whispered prayers, or stared out the window at the shrinking patchwork of earth below. Everyone could feel the descent, but no one could see how close they were to disaster or to salvation. Inside Luca's head, everything slowed. He started visualizing the final approach like a sequence of images: speed, flaps, gear, yoke, throttle idle, hold, flare, nose up, touchdown. That was the rhythm. That was the only way. Mancini disengaged the autopilot. The plane gave a subtle nudge, like a living thing taking a deep breath. 10 miles out. Your hands are on the controls with me, she said. We're flying this together. Luca reached for the side stick. His fingers closed around it. It felt alien, too light, too small. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a sim. It was a multi-ton aircraft descending over a populated city. He couldn't screw this up, not even a little. Naples Tower cleared them for final approach. The runway was now visible, a thin grey line stretching toward them like a promise and a threat. "Flaps two," she commanded. "Flaps two," he repeated, moving the lever. The aircraft responded. No vibration, no warnings. Smooth. "Gear down." He pulled the lever. The whine of hydraulics followed, then the familiar clunk, 3 greens, down and locked. "Speed's good. We're right on the glide slope," Mancini said, more to herself than to him. "Focus. No sudden moves." Luca nodded. The nose of the aircraft dipped slightly. The ground was coming up fast. In that moment, the years of Luca's life flashed behind his eyes, not as cliches but as real memories. His daughter's first steps, the long hours of coding avionics software, the lectures he gave on redundancy systems, the day he promised his wife he'd always come home, and now here he was, praying that promise still held. The runway grew larger, the final approach was underway. This was no longer theory. This was now, and there was no turning back. As the aircraft descended past 3,000 feet, every second stretched like a rubber band near its breaking point. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was surgical, tightly focused, no wasted motion, no unnecessary words. The hum of the engines dropped to a deeper tone, vibrating through the floor beneath Luca's shoes. He could feel it. This wasn't just a descent. It was a dive into the unknown. Outside, the Naples coastline came into view. The early afternoon light gleamed off rooftops and highways. The city felt too close, too detailed. There was no more cruising altitude to hide behind. This was the part where mistakes became irreversible. Naples Tower, AZ-714, short final, runway 24, Mancini transmitted, with a calm that belied the sweat forming on her brow. Cleared to land, AZ-714, wind calm, emergency services in position, came the response. Luca's heart thudded. His hands hovered over the controls, shadowing hers. He didn't dare move unless she said so. The instinct to do something fought with the knowledge that hesitation or panic could doom everyone. But he wasn't frozen. Not anymore. Something had shifted. He reached toward the center console and armed the spoilers. "Speed brakes armed," he said aloud, trying to sound like a real co-pilot. Mancini gave a sharp nod. "Flaps full," she called. He moved the lever. The giant wings adjusted their configuration, extending their flaps to full landing position. The change came with a deep whooshing sound and a new vibration as air flowed differently over the control surfaces. The ground rushed up to meet them. Luca stared at the primary flight display, watching the descent rate, airspeed, and flight path vector. He whispered numbers under his breath. Altitude 1,000 feet, speed 150 knots, glide slope locked, sink rate nominal. It was like stepping back into a familiar room in a house he hadn't visited in years. Things in the same place, but slightly different, and deadly serious. He glanced to his right. Alessia Mancini looked every inch the pilot in command. Focused, intense, holding the aircraft steady as if her hands were fused to the yoke. Her breathing was slow, but her eyes flicked rapidly between instruments and the outside view. They were aligned, perfectly. Gear confirmed down. 3 green. Final checklist complete, Luca said. Outside, emergency lights dotted the sides of the runway, fire trucks and ambulances waiting, crews with radios, hearts likely pounding as fast as his. They crossed the threshold of the runway. The terrain beneath them changed from green and brown to solid gray. 10 feet, the radio altimeter called out. Mancini pulled gently on the yoke. The nose lifted. Idle, she whispered. Idle, Luca confirmed, pulling the thrust levers back. The main landing gear kissed the runway, soft, almost graceful. Then came the second moment of truth, stopping the jet. Reverse, she called. Luca pulled the reverse thrust levers. The roar of the engines shifted into a guttural growl as they fought momentum. The spoilers deployed fully. The brakes activated. The aircraft slowed. The runway markers passed in blurs. 60 knots, Mancini said. Luca exhaled. She steered the jet gently to a stop on the taxiway, not daring to celebrate, not yet. For a moment, the cockpit was silent. Neither of them moved. Then a voice crackled through the radio. AZ-714, confirm. Are you safe on ground? Mancini pressed the button. Affirmative. Aircraft is stopped. We are safe. She turned to Luca, their eyes met, and without a word, she reached over and squeezed his arm, firm, grateful, alive. Behind them, the cabin erupted. Applause, tears, cheering, the flight attendants embraced. passengers wept into their hands or reached for their phones. It was the most human sound imaginable, the sound of people realizing they had just survived the unthinkable. Luca leaned back in his seat, the adrenaline finally draining. His limbs trembled, his head spun. He wasn't sure if he was going to pass out or cry. Maybe both. But one thing was certain. They were on the ground. They were alive. And he had helped land a jumbo jet. As the engines wound down and the aircraft sat motionless on the taxiway, the silence inside the cockpit was almost surreal. Outside, flashing lights and approaching emergency crews created a chaos of movement, but inside the steel shell of the Airbus, everything had frozen. Mancini removed her headset slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the thin glass barrier between calm and collapse. Luca sat back in his seat, completely still, his fingers locked in a tremble against his thighs. His body was still processing the adrenaline, and his mind had not yet caught up with what had just occurred. In the cabin, the initial wave of applause had subsided into sobbing, nervous laughter and quiet phone calls. Some passengers stayed seated, frozen in disbelief. Others began murmuring to each other, voices still laced with tremor. Flight attendants quickly sprang into action, not to distribute snacks or prepare for disembarkation, but to help passengers come back from the brink of fear. They walked the aisles, checking for injuries, reassuring parents, assisting the elderly. One passenger had fainted from stress. Another had suffered a panic attack during the final descent. The attendants, veterans of turbulence and medical diversions, now moved like counselors rather than crew. At the front of the aircraft, the lead purser approached the cockpit and knocked softly. The door cracked open. Mancini gestured for her to come in. "Everyone okay out there?" Mancini asked, her voice hoarse but composed. The purser nodded. "Some panic, some tears, but no injuries. They're calling you a hero already." Mancini exhaled, almost laughing. "Tell them to wait for the inquiry first." The purser turned to Luca. She studied him a moment, as if trying to match the man she'd seen earlier in 14A with the one now seated in the co-pilot's chair. You helped land this?" Luca opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught. He wasn't sure what to say. Was it true? Had he really helped land a jet? He hadn't touched the rudder, hadn't flared perfectly. But he had been there. He had read the checklists. He had armed systems. He had steadied the panic. And most of all, he hadn't frozen. He gave a small nod. "Then you just saved all our lives," she said, eyes shining. She reached over and squeezed his hand before turning back to the cabin. Mancini removed the oxygen mask from Captain Grimaldi's face. He was breathing again, slowly, shallowly, but breathing. The medical team would board in seconds, but for now, she adjusted his seat and secured his belt, as gently as if tucking in a family member. "Hang in there, Captain," she whispered. The first responders appeared at the main door. The aircraft door opened, and with it came a rush of sunlight and the noise of ground crew, medics, radios, and shouting. A medical team came forward and carefully extracted the captain. The flight attendants guided passengers to remain seated while triage began. Mancini unbuckled her harness and finally stood up. Her knees almost gave out. Luca reached to steady her instinctively, and for a second they stood there, supporting each other like soldiers returning from battle. "I've never flown with anyone like you," she said. "I've never flown at all," he replied, managing a small smile. She returned it, though her eyes were glassy. "Let's get out of here." They walked out of the cockpit together into a tunnel of applause from the front rows. A corridor of passengers, tears still drying on their cheeks, clapped and reached out to shake their hands. Some just mouthed, "Thank you," without sound. One woman pressed a crucifix to her lips as Luca passed, whispering something in Italian about angels and miracles. The crew escorted them toward the front as the emergency teams coordinated passenger disembarkation. Luca moved like a man waking from a dream. He could see the flashing lights, feel the air on his face, but none of it registered as fully real yet. A reporter was already on site, pointing a camera toward the tarmac. A ground crew supervisor approached them with wide eyes. "Who is he?" the man asked Mancini, motioning to Luca. "That's not the co-pilot, is it?" "No," she said. "He's a passenger." The supervisor blinked, then looked at Luca as if he were a ghost. "Then how did you land?" Mancini looked at Luca. "Together." Luca said nothing. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel brave. He felt exhausted, drained, but alive. And somehow, that was enough. The sun was beginning to dip behind Mount Vesuvius as Luca sat in a plain grey airport office near the runway, staring at a cup of cold coffee. The adrenaline had long since drained from his veins, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion he couldn't quite shake. He could still feel the vibration of the aircraft in his bones, the pressure of the side stick under his fingers, the relentless surge of disbelief every time he remembered the moment the wheels kissed the tarmac. Outside the small window, flashing lights still dotted the apron where the aircraft had stopped. Buses had already taken the passengers to the terminal. A second crew was managing luggage, coordinating alternate flights, and answering questions from shocked family members. Inside the terminal, media vans had begun to appear. The story had already broken. Passenger helps land. Jet after pilot collapse. The headlines were dramatic, the facts still blurry. He had his phone back now, dozens of missed calls, texts from his wife, a video someone had already posted from inside the plane, cheers erupting as the plane touched down. In the comments below, phrases like miracle, angel, unknown hero. It didn't feel real. Mancini entered the room, still in uniform, but her bun slightly undone, sleeves rolled up. She looked as tired as he felt. She handed him a sandwich and sat down across from him. "They're calling you a national hero," she said. Her voice was low, raw from strain. He shook his head. "I just followed your lead." "No," she said, "you stayed calm, you didn't freeze, you didn't make it harder. That's more than most people could have done." He hesitated, then asked, "Is the captain okay?" "Still unconscious. They've taken him to the cardiac unit. We don't know yet." She rubbed her temples. "They'll investigate everything now. The flight, the systems, the decisions, and us." Luca exhaled. He didn't care about investigations. He didn't want recognition or press or even gratitude. He just wanted to go home. "They want to debrief us soon," Mancini added. "Civil aviation airline officials. They'll want to know how this happened, what we did, why we did it, every second." "Fine," he said, "as long as I don't have to fly again." She smiled for the first time. "You'll probably be offered a license after this." He chuckled. "No thanks, I prefer the ground." A knock at the door interrupted them. A uniformed airport officer stepped in. "There's media already assembling. We've cleared an exit through the side to avoid press, but your face is starting to circulate." Luca stood slowly. His knees were stiff, like he'd run a marathon. His body ached in places he didn't even know could ache from sitting in one seat for less than an hour. As he walked with Mancini down the hallway toward the rear exit of the terminal, flashes from distant cameras lit the glass windows like lightning bugs. A chant had begun to rise. "Il passeggero! Il passeggero!" They stepped outside into the soft dusk. Reporters spotted them immediately. A boom mic swung over the barricade. Someone shouted in English, "What's your name?" Another in Italian, "Come ti senti dopo aver salvato l'aereo?" He didn't answer. Instead, he got into the waiting car, closed the door, and leaned back in his seat. Through the tinted window, he could still hear the crowd. But for the first time all day, he didn't feel alone in what had happened. He had shared it, with a pilot who refused to lose control, with a crew that moved like family, with passengers who had trusted complete strangers to bring them home, and most of all, with himself. For the rest of his life, Luca Benedetti would carry the knowledge that he had done the unimaginable, and no one, not even himself, would ever fully understand how. By morning, Luca Benedetti's name was everywhere. From Italian breakfast shows to international headlines, news anchors repeated the story with mounting awe. A passenger with no formal flying license helps land a commercial Airbus A330 after the pilot collapses mid-flight. It was the kind of headline that demanded disbelief. Photos taken by passengers circulated online, grainy but unmistakable. Luca seated in the co-pilot's chair, headset on, focused, illuminated by the glow of the cockpit instruments. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from friends, colleagues, journalists. His email had been breached. A childhood acquaintance he hadn't spoken to in 20 years had left a voicemail. His old university even issued a statement. "We are proud of our former students' courage and technical skill under unimaginable pressure." But Luca wasn't proud. Not yet. Not even a little. He was staying at a hotel provided by the airline in Naples under the protection of airport security and PR managers. His room was quiet, the windows shuttered. He hadn't slept. He hadn't spoken to his wife on a proper call, only a short, shaky exchange when they'd first landed. Now he sat on the edge of the hotel bed, still wearing the same pants from the flight, and stared blankly at the remote in his hand. The TV across from him was muted, but the footage spoke louder than sound. Fire trucks surrounding the jet, passengers crying, the co-pilot guiding Luca out of the plane. When the knock came, he didn't flinch. It was a representative from the airline, a woman named Martina, polite and crisp in her blazer. She offered him a press briefing schedule, a list of media requests, and the contact of a lawyer if he wanted to decline everything. He glanced at the papers and handed them back. "I'm not interested," he said. She smiled softly. "I didn't think you would be. But you should know. The passengers, many of them want to meet you. Some already left notes at the gate." He looked at her for a long moment. "What for?" "To say thank you." Those words struck something. Gratitude still felt strange. He hadn't rescued anyone from a burning building. He hadn't risked his life by diving into danger. He had sat down, held a stick, read instruments, and followed commands. He hadn't saved anyone. Had he? But the truth was, it had to be him. He was the only one with enough aviation knowledge to bridge the impossible gap between terror and survival. Later that day, a retired pilot arrived at the hotel, sent by the Italian Civil Aviation Authority. He introduced himself, sat with Luca for an informal debrief, and asked him only one question at first. When she said, "You're helping me fly this, why didn't you refuse?" Luca hesitated. "Because someone had to." The man nodded. "That's what a real pilot would say." The statement stirred something uncomfortable. He had always revered pilots as professionals, elite and trained, masters of control and instinct. He had never imagined being compared to one, let alone in a moment of crisis. By that evening, he finally called his wife again. "I saw the news," she said before he could speak. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," he replied. "It doesn't feel real." She paused. "We're proud of you." Their daughter came on the line crying, and all he could do was whisper her name. That night, Luca stood by the hotel window, looking down at the distant lights of Naples, the cars moving like dots on ribbons. He tried to remember every detail of that descent, every breath, every decision, every second where disaster had been only one mistake away. He tried to grasp the weight of it all. But the one thing he couldn't stop thinking was this. What if he hadn't been on that flight? What if no one else had stepped forward? What if the captain had collapsed at a different moment? Those questions would follow him, always. But so would the answer. He had been there, he had acted, and because of that 223 people were alive, and the world had watched a miracle unfold at 35,000 feet. Luca had expected the noise to stop once the plane touched down. He thought landing would be the finish line, but instead, the moment the aircraft's wheels kissed the runway and the reverse thrust roared to life, the world around him only got louder. Emergency vehicles swarmed the aircraft like bees to a disturbed hive. Sirens didn't blare, they were silent, but their urgency was obvious in their movement. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the fuselage from all directions. Medics rushed up the stairs with oxygen tanks and crash carts. Firemen stood by, ready for anything. Ground crew guided them with practiced calm, but the anxiety in their faces betrayed the reality. They had no protocol for a situation like this. As the cabin door opened, a wave of warm air rushed in. The smell of jet fuel mixed with sun and metal. The first responders moved quickly past the stunned passengers to the cockpit. They gently lifted Captain Grimaldi from his seat. He was unconscious, but stable. His chest rose and fell with oxygen-assisted breaths. Mancini stood aside as they worked, her arms crossed tightly, as if holding herself together. Luca didn't speak. He watched the medical team do their work, his hand still trembling slightly from the pressure, the effort, the unreleased adrenaline that now sat under his skin like static electricity. When he finally stepped out of the cockpit, the flight attendants applauded. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, solemn, and full of something unspoken: gratitude, relief, shock. One attendant's eyes were red from crying. Another offered a small nod, unable to speak. The passengers in the front rows began to stand. Some clapped, others just reached out, lightly touching his arm as he passed. A man in his 70s removed his cap. A woman whispered, "Grazie, signore." Another passenger kissed her fingers and pointed upward. Luca walked past them all, feeling like he was moving through a movie scene he hadn't auditioned for. Every gesture of thanks felt overwhelming. He didn't know what to say. He didn't feel deserving. He wasn't supposed to be in that cockpit. He had no badge, no epaulets, no stripes on his shoulder. Just a mind trained on systems and the terrifying clarity of someone who knew what would happen if no one else acted. Outside, under the blinding Mediterranean sun, a crowd had already gathered near the terminal. Media crews, passengers who had deplaned ahead of him, airline officials. Someone was holding up a sign that said "Hero," hand-drawn with shaky lettering. Hero. He kept his head down as they escorted him to a private airport vehicle. He slid into the back seat and looked out the window as the plane slowly shrank behind him. Hours later, in the debriefing room, an airline psychologist asked him how he felt. Luca gave a strange smile and said, "Like I borrowed a life I didn't earn. You saved that life," she replied gently. He didn't answer. He thought about the sounds that had stayed with him. The autopilot chime when it disconnected, the wind against the fuselage as the descent began, the voice of First Officer Mancini saying, "We're flying this together." And then, finally, the sound of the wheels touching down. That subtle, almost delicate sound that had carried so much weight. The airline began preparing a press release. His name would be in it, whether he liked it or not. There was talk of recognition, awards, public thanks. But Luca didn't want a spotlight. He just wanted a return to quiet. That night, in his hotel room, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail again and again, not to relive it, but because his brain refused to let it go. He had walked through a door few people ever crossed, into a space meant for pilots, leaders, professionals. He had felt the fear, taken the weight, and come out the other side. But part of him was still up there, 35,000 feet above the ground, in that seat, holding the yoke, whispering the landing checklist, trusting that knowledge and courage were enough to carry them home. By the third day, Luca could no longer avoid the world. The hotel staff knew his name. The waiters at breakfast gave nervous glances. Even the housekeeper left a folded note on the desk. "Thank you. My sister was on your flight." It was written in shaky English, scrawled next to a simple drawing of an airplane and a heart. He couldn't hide anymore, and worse, he wasn't allowed to. The aviation inquiry had begun immediately. Italian authorities launched a full internal review. The captain's medical records, the co-pilot's qualifications, the aircraft maintenance logs, and, inevitably, Luca's history. Investigators wanted to know everything about the man who sat in the co-pilot seat, even though he wasn't supposed to be there. He sat in front of a panel of 5 officials, flanked by legal representatives from the airline. They offered him water and opened with formal questions. The room was sterile, all white walls and fluorescent lights, but the atmosphere was charged with gravity. "Please describe the moment you entered the cockpit," one official said. Luca told them. The symptoms the captain displayed, the request from Mancini, the lack of other viable options, his own hesitation, and finally, the decision to sit down. "You were not licensed," another official said. "I wasn't. I had training. I never claimed to be a pilot. I never touched the flight controls unless asked." They nodded. They knew. Everything had been recorded. Cockpit voice recordings, system logs, data from the black box. It was all there. What surprised Luca was that they didn't accuse. They listened. Another investigator leaned forward. "You have over 1,000 hours logged in simulators." "Yes. I used to teach system operations, mostly avionics. Would you consider returning to that field?" Luca blinked. "Why?" "Because we need people who don't panic when it matters." That night, his name trended on social media. There were memes, tributes, animations. A clip of the aircraft landing had been recreated with dramatic music and posted to a YouTube channel that called him the passenger who became a pilot. It had 2.3 million views in 24 hours. But not all reactions were praise. Some online critics questioned the airline's judgment. "How was an unqualified person allowed in the cockpit?" one headline asked. Others doubted the severity of the pilot's condition, claiming media exaggeration. Luca didn't respond. He didn't even read most of it. He only cared about one thing, the status of Captain Grimaldi. Finally, a message came through from the airline's medical team. The captain was stable. He had suffered a heart rhythm disturbance. He had survived thanks to quick cabin intervention, and because the aircraft landed in time. Luca sat alone in the hotel room, absorbing the news. He hadn't killed anyone. He hadn't failed. He'd helped save the life of the man who once had full command of the aircraft. For the first time, Luca allowed himself to breathe deeply. The next day, the airline's CEO requested a private meeting. She shook Luca's hand personally, thanked him for his actions, and offered to sponsor his return to aviation, formally, fully. "You don't have to go back into a cockpit," she said. "But if you ever want to, we'll help you get there." He declined politely. "I think I had my one flight." Then came the passengers. One by one, they found ways to reach out. A video from a young girl thanking him for giving her another chance to see her grandfather. An email from a man who had planned to propose to his girlfriend after landing. A letter from an elderly woman who simply wrote, "We needed someone to believe it could be done. You did." Luca didn't know how to accept all this. He wasn't trying to be anything, but somehow, just by being there, just by not backing away, he had become something rare, a man who showed what ordinary courage looks like when no one else steps forward. He would return home soon, to quiet, to routine, to the comfort of being nobody again. But the world would remember something different, not because he was perfect, but because he showed up. Luca stood on the edge of the tarmac 3 weeks after the incident, watching as a new Airbus prepared for departure. It wasn't the same aircraft, but the silhouette was identical. The long wings arched against the pale sky. The engines hummed with calm certainty. To most passengers, it was just another flight. To Luca, it would never be just that again. The airline had invited him back, not for publicity, but for closure. A gesture, they said, to give him peace. He hadn't accepted easily, but in the end, he agreed. Part of him needed to see the beginning of a flight again, from the outside, not as the man dragged into the storm, but as someone choosing to face what he now understood more than anyone ever should. In the weeks since the emergency landing, the story had settled into the public consciousness. It wasn't viral anymore. It wasn't fresh. But it had taken on something greater than headlines. It had become a modern myth, retold in different languages, taught in CRM, crew resource management courses, shared at conferences, debated in flight schools. A man with no license, no rank, no plan, sat beside a lone first officer and helped land an aircraft carrying more than 200 souls. But the truth had always been more subtle than that. Luca hadn't saved the day alone. He'd been part of a chain: Mancini's leadership, the flight attendants' professionalism, the passengers' trust, the medics waiting on the ground. He was one link. But what set him apart was simple. He didn't freeze. He had acted. He had tried. And in a world where hesitation is often the difference between survival and disaster, trying had been everything. He walked slowly toward the gate. A few passengers recognized him, but they didn't approach. They just nodded, some with respectful smiles. Word had spread. This was the man, the one who'd done it. Inside the terminal, an airline representative handed him a letter from one of the passengers. It was handwritten in English, clearly not the person's first language. "I prayed for a miracle that day. You were that miracle, not because you are a pilot, but because you had the courage to not look away." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. He would go home now. Not to be a hero, not to give speeches or sign books, but to return to his wife, his daughter, his life before it all. Still, something inside him had changed permanently. He no longer saw ordinary people as powerless. He no longer believed that survival depended only on the trained, the certified, the uniformed. Sometimes survival came down to a simple, terrifying moment. When everything falls apart, do you step forward? He had. And in doing so, he had proven a quiet truth, one that would outlast the headlines and fade into the kind of story people told to inspire others. Not every hero wears wings. Some just take a seat and hold on until the world is safe again.